So the first thing we would do is import the flight file using the regular max import command. Go to File, Import File, navigate to your flight model. Here we want to uncheck read external references. We don't want to import any of those. Most of the files, most of the models will not have them, but we want to uncheck this just to be sure. Now, some of the flight models may have different LOD levels in them, but for our process, we need to use just the highest level of detail model possible and delete any other geometry in the model. So what we're going to do is go to the highest LOD level of the model using the Flight Studio control panel on the right. You can see where it's located. We're going to go to the most highest LOD level, select all of the geometry in the scene that's visible right now. We're going to deselect the nodes, the helper nodes, in the very center of the screen there at the grid coordinates 0, 0. We don't need those, we're going to delete them. And now that we only have the highest level of detail model selected, we're going to unhide the rest of elements in the scene so that we can delete them. So what we're going to do here is select invert. This way we're selecting everything that is not the highest level detail model, and we're going to delete that from the scene. At the top of the model, you see those two light node polygons. We want to get rid of them as well. We will either re-add them later manually, or they will be handled by another process. Now, in most cases, when you import a flight model, it will be broken up in different pieces. It will not be just one poly model. So what we do here, the next step would be to select all those pieces and to join them just into a single model. We can select any of the pieces, convert it to a poly model, and then using the attach list command, we can attach every other geometry in the scene, creating one single object. This is an extra step. It's not required to do in most cases, but if you just happen to see anything that's off with the model, you know, something that's clearly not quite right, you can spend a few seconds to tweak it and fix it, but really you're not required to, and definitely do not spend a whole lot of time doing this kind of stuff. Now, this next step is optional as well. What I'm doing here is I am removing duplicated geometry in the model so that when I render out the texture later, my UVs will be larger, taking up less space. This will make sense when we actually get to the render texture step, but for example, in this case, in this model case, is if you render out the texture it as is, each one of those legs, platform supports, they will take up their own space in the rendered texture. But what we can do is take out the duplicated ones, and what that will allow is the remaining single platform support to take up more texture space, which will create a more detailed texture. It will be larger in size. Again, this will make more sense once we look at the texture here in a couple of minutes. And once again, if you see anything odd with the model that could be fixed very quickly to optimize it, go ahead and do that, but it's definitely not required. In this case, we have extra edges in the surface, on the sides of the platform, as you can see there, which really should not be there. They provide no function for the model whatsoever. So we're going to remove them, thus reducing the polygon count and making the finished UVs much simpler and cleaner. Another quick step I highly recommend doing is selecting the model, making a symmetry modifier, move out the symmetrical part of the model, and then delete it. What happens here is we end up with the same model we started with before we added any symmetry modifier. But what the symmetry modifier I found does, it resets the normals shading of the model. When you first import the flight file, a lot of the normals are a little janked up. They look odd, not the way they should. But if you apply a symmetry modifier, it kind of resets them and makes everything look cleanly. It's not super obvious here, and sometimes it is obvious, but if you were to export this model back into the flight file and look at it in our viewer, the shading issues would become very obvious. And now we'll go to render to texture dialog. Majority of the default options are perfectly fine for you to use. For the output, go ahead and add a diffuse map. For little models like this, we will probably go with a 1024 by 1024 size texture, at least for now. It's definitely larger than it needs to be, but we can always make it smaller later. For our purposes, it's better to start with a larger texture size, and then if we need to, we can downsize it, scale it down. At the very top, make sure you define the texture path to save out to. This is the location of the combined texture file, the location where it will be rendered. In the automatic mapping window, you can set the spacing to something a little even smaller than what it is, maybe something like 0.01 or even 0.05. This is the spacing between different texture UV elements in the finished UV map that is being auto-generated. If you set the spacing to less, there will be less empty space between the UV elements, so the UV elements themselves will be bigger, resulting in a higher resolution texture. Go ahead and hit render, don't worry about the prompt. And here's our first pass of the diffuse texture. Now, very important to note, the window you see here may not actually be the same as the file that you've rendered out, that you've saved with this process, the file location for which we've specified earlier. The lighting in the rendered file, the one that was saved to the folder, could be different than what you see here. So it's important to remember that you will be working with that saved file and not the one you see here in this window. They are not the same. Also, here is what I meant by UV efficiency earlier. If we kept all of those 4 supports before rendering the texture out, we would have seen a copy of those support leg textures repeated 4 times. So they would have taken up a lot more space in the UV window, and they would have been smaller in size as a result, because the program would try to fit all of them in there together. So this way we've rendered out just one support, and we can duplicate it using the same UV coordinates. Go ahead and drag it into the material window of Max and set all of the ambient, diffuse, specular window maps to white, pure white, and zero out the specular level, glossiness, and soften. And then go to the diffuse map window and change the map channel from 1 to 3. Reason being is channel 3 is the channel that the auto unwrap used to create our baked texture, whereas channel 1 is the original texture channel. So in order for our new texture map to work, you need to apply it using UV channel 3. And there you can see the applied texture. There is no alphas being displayed here, but it is an alpha texture, and you will see the finished result when we open it up back in Flight Studio. Now we're going to collapse the automatic unwrap modifier by just converting the model to polygon again. And we can now very quickly and easily recreate those texture posts, support posts. And I should mention again, this step will not be, it's not required to begin with, and most of the models will probably not need this step. You should only do it if the model kind of allows for it. It has some repeated geometry that you can take advantage of. And if it's something that you can do very quickly, it's not something you want to spend a whole lot of time on. Same thing here. When we look at the top view, we can see that a lot of the vertices are a little bit off. They're diagonal, they're not really lined up. It's something I can fix very quickly, but again, it's not required. you can fix it if you can do it quickly, if you have the time, but this is not a required step. So what I'm doing here is I'm just flattening everything out, making all the lines perpendicular. Next, open up the flight hierarchy again. Make sure that we only have the one node, our model that we created. There are no helper nodes or anything or any other geometry. Click on it, and these are the settings that you want to make sure the model has. The lighting mode should be face color smooth. Drawing mode should be solid one-sided. And then the other important ones are billboard should be set to fixed no alpha. Use max normals should be yes. Has flight material should be no. And keep tries on export should be yes. Now we're ready to export the file. Go ahead and export. Select the location. Select Flight Studio as the file format. And click Save. Leave the default options as they are. The auto group and the auto object should be checked, which is fine. And go ahead and open up the newly created exported model in Creator Studio. Now I found that for some reason when I export my models, the surfaces colored black, but we can fix that very easily and quickly. Select Face as the sub-object selection mode. Double-click one of the faces to bring up the Properties dialog. And where you see those two black colors for the primary and the secondary color of the faces, so we just want to set those to white. So just hover the mouse over them and use the paint drop bucket to click, and the default color is usually white, so that should fix that. Now, as you remember, I mentioned that the ladders are transparent, so we need to select them and set their transparency mode to fixed with alpha. Open up the texture panel, make sure the texture is set to MipMap Triangular and Sharpen in the top two selections there. And now go to Model Hierarchy. And if you want, you can put the alpha faces with the alpha transparent ones into their own object node. It's helpful, it's not required. So if you can do it quickly, do it, but it should not be necessary. And we also want to add a basic LOD node as well. The default distance should be fine. And just freeze the center coordinates.